Hi, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 11B live lesson for today. This lesson is going to be on contemporary literature. It's the second lesson in Unit 3, and we're getting close to the end. There are only 3 more lessons left in the class. This one is a kind of like an average lesson. We've had some longer ones leading in from Unit 2, so this one won't be quite as long as all of those, but there is information to explain, so let's get into it. I'm gonna share my screen now, and then we'll get started. Let's see. Here we go. Contemporary literature. And we'll start at slide 5 like usual. So they give you some notes about what you need to know and be familiar with before we go into this lesson. So I'll go over those things with you. So the 2 concepts they give you are primary source. And here in the lesson, it just says a work that contains original or firsthand information such as a photograph, an eyewitness newspaper report, or an autobiography. So that means it's coming from the actual source, the person who was part of the event or who was there to witness the event. And then it also says style. Style is the second and last one. It says the combination of distinctive features of a literary or artistic expression, execution, or performance characterizing a particular person, group, school, or era. Now, this definition is kind of the long way around basically just describing the way a person writes. So not just the types of words that they use, but sometimes the way that they use them, certain descriptions that they use over and over, whether or not they tend to use complicated words or simple words, whether or not they use a lot of heavy like metaphors and imagery, or if they're just straight to the point, here's directly what it is. Just think of style for writing the same way that you would style for clothing. Certain people gravitate towards different colors. They have a favorite color or a style in terms of accessories. Some people have like cute fashion. Some people have like emo fashion or metal fashion. Some people have like streetwear fashion or hip hop fashion. And there are different accessories that you expect whenever someone says, for example, oh, I like streetwear or I like cottagecore, those kind of things. It's the same way with style for writing. There are just certain words, phrases, ways of writing, shorter sentences, longer sentences, all of those things. That counts in a person's writing style too. Everyone doesn't write the same way. The way that you would write a story is very different from how someone else might write a story. And the last thing that they go over here is historical and cultural context. So basically, the reason why historical and cultural context is important is because it gives you an understanding of the background of what you're reading. So from this class forward, you're going to have a lot of history and culture information that's given to you from the things that you read. So you're going to get lessons that have basically 2 parts. We'll get history behind the history behind the writing. So what was going on in history at the time in the location where this was written, and what were important issues to people at the time, because those things affect what people write and read. If something is a problem, or if people are looking forward to something or feeling good about something that's happening in their country, location, city, region, whatever, those sort of things are going to be incorporated into their stories. Sometimes you'll get like cultural movements, like, for example, people looking back to the past to honor like Roman writing styles, or to honor really old ways of doing things. So you'll get a lot of, for example, biblical references in writing. If someone, if it's popular to look back, if the culture is specifically religious or something like that. So basically, it's just important to remember that whatever is happening at the time shapes how people write things. A really famous example of this is comic books. So comic book movies are popular now, and a lot of them discuss issues that we consider to be important right now in terms of like how things are going in terms of relationships between cities, nations, and stuff like that. But back in the day, for example, I'll throw out a superhero, the Hulk. Most people know the Hulk. He's radioactive, big and green, right? But the reason why his origin story features so much science and radiation is because at the time that he was written, people were very worried about the US going to nuclear war with Russia and other Axis powers from World War II. The Cold War was kind of in the middle / closing. And the Cold War was basically the US and Russia stocking up more and more radioactive nuclear type technology to try to outpace each other. So because people were worried about that, the effects of that and how it might affect a person was incorporated into that comic. Likewise, when we look at heroes like Batman, for example, when we're dealing with how city crimes might be spiking in certain places, how people deal with the difficulty of like loss in their lives and trying to seek out justice. Those issues coming up in people's very real lives is pretty much what influences people to write those kind of things. If those were not concerns that were written or that were happening at the time, those things wouldn't have been written like that. So you have to remember, it's I know that some of these lessons that we've had in this class have gone over some history stuff too. And the reason why that stuff is important is because it gives you the background. Why did someone write this? Well, because the issues they wrote about were important at the time and they wanted to express it in the way that they did in this story. So the point can be summarized in this one sentence. Without the context, the literature can't be fully understood. So for example, if you were to write about your day, right? Just a normal everyday that you live lots and lots of times. Say you write about literally today and you put it in a capsule and bury it somewhere. If people in the future were to dig that up and see references to YouTube or Facebook or TikTok, depending on how far in the future they dig it up, they might not know what those things are. Maybe in 200 years, we won't have anything by those names. There will be services that have different names, or the technology will be completely different. So people won't be able to recognize what it is you're talking about. It's exactly the same with these old things that we're reading. So that's why knowing the history is important. And you've kind of been getting and will continue to get little history lessons inside of these assignments. Okay, so slide 6 goes into primary source stuff. So pretty much this is just explaining the relationship between primary sources, that's the first-hand source, and other works. So it says here, primary source documents often provide context for a literary work. So just as a reminder from the last slide, the primary source has information that is directly from the time period or the event that happened. So if someone is writing a report on, say, the Civil War, right? What you will want to do is try to find maybe an old written interview with a soldier who survived the war. Maybe you will want to try to find original photos that soldiers took during the war to document it. Those are primary sources, straight from the horse's mouth, to use the saying. So they give you an example here of someone using a source document for their story. So they talk about Jack London's 1917 essay, The Human Drift. That's where we are here. It discusses the application of evolution to human expansion. So basically talking about how evolution has affected humans expanding over the world. So London cites as a source, so he uses information, that's what citing is. He uses information and lets people know that he gets information from Charles Woodruff's book called The Expansion of Races. And the reason why he uses this is because this book theorizes about the evolution of humans from the general evolution concept on the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. So basically, Charles Darwin wrote about um, How Humans Evolved. Charles Woodruff wrote a document talking about how that evolution would affect um, humans into the future, and how it may have affected the way that they've spread. So because Charles Woodruff made this document theorizing on stuff and expressing his ideas, Jack London can quote it. He can actually quote it and say, hey, this important person from the past, or this important person who's done research, wrote these things. And this is what he said about it. So basically what Jack London did was cite an expert source, someone who had studied, someone who wrote their own information about the topic, and he put it in his essay. Now, the reason why this is important is because reading, so basically, our understanding of evolution and how it works is very different from what they thought at the time. So if you're reading Jack London's 1917 essay, and he says something that sounds weird or that doesn't make sense based on what we know about biology, it's important to know where he got his information from. He got his information from Charles Woodruff's Expansion of Races, which was published not too long after The Origin of Species. So that's like in 18, I'd say 59, 60, something like that. And the reason why that's important to know is because back then in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, their idea of how evolution works was very different. So that explains the things that Jack London thinks in his book. If you didn't know where his source was coming from, you would read it and say, like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, who would ever publish this? Who would believe this? But when you're reading historical stuff, it's important to keep in mind what people thought and felt at the time. And that's why historical context is important. So on slide 7, we go into a little more detail about it. There in this slide, basically, they're talking about primary source documents written by the author of the work themselves. So basically, if you read an essay that was written by the author of a book that you're doing a report on, you can use that as a source because the author is talking about their own work. And they give you the example of Catch-22. So Catch-22 is a book that focuses on someone who's in the military. The author, Joseph Heller, was inspired by his own experience in World War II. So he actually wrote an autobiography. So he wrote a biography about himself explaining his situation and what he lived through and how he felt about it. So if you're doing like a paper on Catch-22 and trying to give people information, you could read articles about World War II, and that might help you a little bit. But since Joseph Heller wrote Catch-22 and also wrote an autobiography, you would get more out of reading his autobiography than you would just reading random articles about the war. And then they give you some information just about this. So Catch-22, set during World War II, is about a military officer's practice of extending bomber pilots' tours of duty. So basically, when a pilot successfully completes their bombing mission, his success causes the officer to extend the pilot's time of service. So if a pilot says he's going insane and asks to be grounded, he's basically kept in the air. So the idea behind Catch-22, the phrase Catch-22 refers to a cycle that feeds into itself. So the idea here is that if you're aware of the dangers of flying while insane and you're saying you think you're crazy, you obviously are not crazy. You're just sane enough to know how dangerous it is. So you're sane enough to stay in the air. I'm going to repeat that one more time. In this story, according to the officer, a pilot cannot be insane if he knows how dangerous it is to fly while he's insane. So he uses this rule to keep pilots in the air. If someone says, this job is making me go crazy and I need to be grounded and have a break, What the officer says in reply is, for you to say that you think you're going crazy, that means that you're aware enough to actually not be crazy. So you're actually good, and we're going to put you back up in the air. So that's the catch 22. An officer thinks he's going insane and he's like, please no more. But because he says that, the officer knows that they have sound mind enough to go on another tour. So a catch 22 is basically that, a no-win scenario where doing one action makes the circumstances where you have to do the action continue. It says here, Heller's novel used these no-win situations and others to explore a type of unsolvable dilemma, now known as the catch-22. And in his autobiography, he relates the catch-22s that he and other pilots experiences, identifying some of the pilots as the source for various characters in the novel. So you actually get to know about the people who inspired the characters in the novel if you read his autobiography. But you wouldn't get it just from reading secondary sources or documents of things that people have put together. Okay. Let's see. Slide 10 is the contemporary period. So it says, before you begin, be familiar with the following. They give you some information. It's two things, genres. I'll start there. A genre is a classification for literature that's characterized by particular content and form. So I'm going to just give you an example. Sci-fi is a genre. Horror is a drama. Is a genre. Drama is a genre. Murder mysteries are a genre. All of these things are sections of storytelling that have traits and hallmarks that people can recognize. And it's the same way with books as it is with movies. So different books, if your book fits into a horror or a gothic situation, then you would be able to look at the signs and actually classify it. So when your movie starts with a cabin in the middle of the woods and someone with a camera who's filming things from first person point of view, and they're running back and forth, you know that first of all, it's going to be a thriller or a horror movie, depending on other elements. And two, it's in the found footage format. Those are all genres from the things that you recognize, and you can take the clues and put them together. The second thing to remember is dystopia. A dystopia is a fictional setting where the living conditions are extremely poor or people are severely deprived. Now, usually dystopias are used in science fiction. So you find like in the future, things are just really bad. But dystopias can exist in other genres besides science fiction. So now that we know those two things, this paragraph introduces us to the contemporary period. So they start by telling you that the beginnings of the contemporary literary period coincide or happened at the same time as a major period of social activism in the civil rights arena. And then they tell you, in particular, it was the feminist movement. So this was definitely a time of political unrest. And they let you know, by example, that the Watergate scandal happened around this time. And President Richard Nixon actually had to resign. So you have a president that had to basically quit over a scandal, and people were fighting for women's rights at the time. So this is the setting where this period began. And then it says protests and rallies were common across the country during the 1960s and 1970s. So this is information that's important for you to understand the sort of things that were written at the time. It says here, like the two preceding movements, modernism and postmodernism, remember those were movements responding to both World War I and World War II. The contemporary period emerged in response to the changing social political atmosphere in the United States. So basically they're saying there were lots of changes to how people wanted things to work socially and how people wanted things to work politically. So the contemporary period is after Modernism and postmodernism. That's the first important thing. And then secondly, it was in response to things changing again socially and politically in the US. And then they, tell you, just in case you haven't picked it up, that the contemporary period wasn't a response to war this time. Instead, it was in response to the Cold War, which I mentioned before. And that was when Russia and the US were racing to stack technology. They were racing to get to the moon first. They were racing to stockpile nuclear weapons and just racing to have sort of like the superior hold over world influence. So that was happening, the tumultuous US political landscape. So just the fact that everything was changing and people were protesting, and the steady adoption of technological advancements. So people were definitely concerned about technology moving too fast. And that was part of the contemporary period. So the next slide, 11, directly goes into the influence of technology. It says here, the increase in US adoption of technology affected all aspects of life as televisions and then computers became commonplace in the average household. So things that represented this shift was the election of former television and movie star Ronald Reagan to the US presidency. So that's important. We had someone who was previously on TV elected as president. And that's definitely very different than the credentials that people wanted in a president before, or that won the presidency before. So that's a big signal that the technology at the time had influence. Someone who was on TV and in movies ended up becoming president. That's very wildly different than someone who had like military service, or someone that had government service, like a long government career just leading up to them trying out for president. This is very different. And then they tell you at the bottom what we already know. Television and the internet made the world a smaller place. So there was also new technology with other types of connections as well. So basically you can know what was going on in other places in the world without having to leave your country. And the speed with which this information actually traveled also affected things a lot. Basically, people didn't have to rely on the government to publicly release information about what was happening. They could actually watch the news and watch journalists actually travel and show you what was happening in other places. So on slide 12, we talk about the inclusion and influence of technology. So inclusion is like taking something into account, or including technology when you consider things. So in terms of reading and writing, this is when you're actually putting technology that you think might exist in the future or that exists now into your stories. There are a lot of writing movements that look back to the past and try to write about what the past was like. But in this movement, the contemporary movement, we included technology that actually existed now and things that we thought might exist in the future. So they give you some examples of this, which is cyberpunk, and they give you some information about cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is a genre that's credited to a contemporary fiction writer whose name is Bruce Bethke. And basically, the summary of cyberpunk is a genre that addresses the dehumanizing and potentially dystopian outcome of dependence on high-end technology. So cyberpunk is specifically a genre where technology has gotten to the point where people need it to actually live. If the society doesn't actually need technology to live, especially high-end technology, then it's not cyberpunk. So if you've played games where like people have cybernetic attachments, where maybe medical services have to be like leased from like machines that are out on the street, and there aren't any like hospitals and that sort of thing, that's cyberpunk. When people have implants, when people have chips, or when people are like enhanced at birth to make sure that they have all of the right traits and there are no genetic features, and people are not allowed to be like born normally, that's those things would fit into cyberpunk. And then they tell you about the word cyberspace, which was coined by contemporary author William Gibson. I know that cyberspace sounds like really old and played out, but there are still some books and TV shows that actually use that word. He used it in a short story called Burning Chrome. And he also used it in his novel called Neuromancer. So it became popular from people seeing it in those works. So slide 14 just gives you a summary of contemporary literature. So like we've got the background, we understand the history, what was happening at the time, especially how technology affected writing and what people put in their writing. So now we get the summary of what contemporary literature is as a whole, because it's not just limited to technology, because there was the social, economic, and political stuff going on. Those things are going to be a part of contemporary literature too. So this gives us a summary of how it all came together. So the first thing they tell us is that a defining characteristic of contemporary literature is the broad influence of cultural diversity. So remember when we were talking about TVs and the internet allowing people to see what's happening beyond the world. So including information about different cultures and stuff is a part of contemporary literature. And because people were more exposed to how things were in other parts of the world and expressions of your culture, even if you weren't born in America, was normalized, a lot of second and third generation immigrants were able to put their own spin on the things that were being written at the time. Before, it was really hard to be published if you came from another country or your parents came from another country, because the idea was that people wouldn't be interested in those things. But knowing about the greater world and what's in it encouraged people to actually learn more about the people around them who may have parents or grandparents who are immigrants. So it says here, another characteristic is the divergence from tradition seen in modernism and postmodernism. So they blurred definitional lines even further than those two things. Just as a reminder, modernism and postmodernism were movements that tried to blur the line between fiction and reality by writing basically fiction in a way that was about things that could actually really happen. So the idea was that they took realism and tried to make it into sort of its own art movement. And postmodernism just took that to the extreme. So they're saying that contemporary literature has some of those traits, and it blurs the lines between older traditions and newer traditions. So it says contemporary literature continues to re-examine and reinvent, so that means make new forms of form. That's the way that people write things, genre, and other aspects of writing. So when they say form here, they mean the way that people publish and write books. So we've all picked up a book. We know how a story goes. You start at the beginning, you get more information. There's a problem. People make a decision about the problem gets solved, and then we see what happens at the end, right? But there are books that don't follow that format. There are books that are broken up into different sections. They're not just straight chapters. There are some books that are broken up into 3 parts, maybe, and you get a perspective from a different character in each part. That's breaking from tradition. Sometimes you'll get a book that has a lot of different perspectives in it. Maybe the story doesn't actually have a plot. It just shows you the lives of these people, and you're supposed to try to get whatever you can out of it. That's also differing from form. So when they say play with form, they mean play with what the idea of a traditional story is from the perspective of people who are used to reading normal books. And when they reinvent genre, that's basically them taking bits and pieces from genres that already exist, like gothic horror, action, realism, romanticism, all of those things, taking bits and pieces of the stuff that made those iconic and mixing them together. So for example, cyberpunk mixes some elements of realism in terms of things not working out neatly, things they're not always being a hero, things not being tied up neatly in a bow. It combines it with sci-fi. So we get new genres that way. So they give you basically the example of Truman Capote. So it says his novel In Cold Blood, described as a nonfiction novel, uses the techniques of fiction to explore a real life crime. Although no motive had ever been publicly revealed, Capote surmises and invents the fictional thoughts of a real life person committing a real murder, effectively blurring the line between fiction and nonfiction. So he wrote a made up story about a person who commits a crime in a very realistic way. So the nonfiction novel is basically a lot of what we know to be stories these days. We're taking something that a person might find disturbing to read about firsthand and sort of making it up. So you would study a lot of like true crime interrogations and stuff like that, so that you could realistically write a very believable character who's committing crimes. And that would lead people reading the book to think, how does he know so much about this? Did he commit a crime? How is he able to write this so accurately? So fiction is something that is normally made up. And novels are a part of fiction. Usually, if you have a novel, it is fiction. So to call something a nonfiction novel, he's emphasizing that even though it's made up, it still reads like it's real. So that's technically what you would call like a new genre or a subgenre. It's a new category of story that people were not doing before he wrote it. All right. So slide 16, we're getting to personal background and literary perspectives. So since contemporary literature was inspired a whole lot by getting to see other people's cultures and learning more about other people because of the internet and TV reporting, that definitely affected the contemporary movement. So we talk about here in this slide the ways that sort of changed writing in the US. So people in different countries have different upbringings, lifestyles, and educations. And I know that that's something that people know, but I think that if you don't spend time actually thinking about it, it doesn't occur to you that people do things in different ways if they come from different places. If you thought a little more about it, it's entirely possible that someone you know who has like a really odd habit or practice might have just learned that from their parents or other relatives. Or from a country that they were born in, where people do things differently. So they give you an example here. There are some cultures where people are raised to follow rules. Like it's just actually important for you to follow rules and be an upstanding person in the way that your society defines them. But there are people from other countries that maybe they have been ruled by a dictator for a long time. Maybe they're used to their government not actually looking out for the people. Maybe they just come from a culture where it's encouraged to be a free thinker, right? So a lot of the time, people from those sort of countries are taught to question the way things are. And it's very easy to say like, oh, well, if you have common sense, you should definitely question the way things are all the time. But not everyone grows up being taught those values, especially if you're moving from a different country to the US. It might be very jarring and odd for people to question things all the time and not trust like their government or the community around them to take care of them. So because these ways of living are so different around the world, that means that literature also shows these differences. If a person from India or a person from Turkey or Russia writes a book about what their childhood was like, all of those countries, all of those stories are going to have different things in them because of the different countries that the authors come from. There are some things that are universal that people understand, like growing up and feeling awkward and wanting to find a place to belong, right? But there are other things that are actually just different based on how you were raised. So a lot of the time, writers will allude to or reference their heritage and background in their stories. Sometimes authors will just only write about people from their culture. They allow the people from their background and heritage to be the stars of the story. So you get to learn more about that culture while you're reading. The reason why a lot of these lessons, for example, show you and give you information about the childhood of the author is for exactly that reason. Because if you know how they grew up, you know what sort of things affected their lives. So it says, reflecting on the idea of the United States as a salad bowl of diverse cultures, authors from different backgrounds offer readers a view of the cultural influences that have shaped their thoughts, perspectives, and visions. So on this next slide, there's going to be a video on writing perspectives. So this video is 4 minutes and 45 seconds long, so about 5 minutes. And it gives you information about writing perspectives and how, if you were writing a story, you would incorporate that. So basically, the idea of this video is one friend calling another for advice on how to include their background in the story. So when you're looking at this video, keep in mind that 3 things. This video talks about influences in writing and where you might see them. It talks about how authors are impacted or changed or affected by their influences. And 3, it talks about how to read into influences in a story based on how it's written. So it gives you, like a couple examples. So take the 5 minutes to look at this video, and then you can meet me on slide 19. That's where I'll be picking up. Okay, slide 19. We are learning about the reading selection and the author. So the selection is called Once in a Lifetime, and the author is Jhumpa Lahiri. So Lahiri was born in London, but he had Bengali Indian parents. And she was nicknamed Nilanjana. So basically, she moved to the US with her family, but she visited a lot of her extended family in India very frequently. They called her Jhumpa, which is basically an affectionate nickname. But in Bengali culture, family and close friends call a child by a nickname, but their first name or their given name is used in public. So her actual name was Nilanjana, but the name that she went by most frequently was Jhumpa Lahiri. So her parents tried to enroll her in school under her given name, Nilanjana, but the teacher at the school asked if she went by a shorter name. So she ended up having to deal with someone who wasn't close to her at all, who was not her family, calling her Jhumpa, even though usually in her culture, that's like a private family name sort of thing. So that was one example of an awkward experience that she had in terms of dealing with cultural differences. So she writes about Indian immigrants to the US and their experiences dealing with these kinds of cultural differences. That slips a lot into her work because that's what she's experienced. And she tends to explore the relationships of immigrants and their American-born children, just like in her novel, The Namesake. So they give you a little more information about her. Her first book of short stories, Interpreter of Maladies, won the Pulitzer Prize in the year 2000. And she was the first Indian woman to win this award. So because she definitely went through a lot when it came to adjusting to American culture and sort of finding her groove between American culture and her native culture, that's what her writing centers on. So on slide 20, we're on exploring a title. So this is a picture of Lahiri here on the left. and basically it's just to give you more imagery of her. She was nominated for a number of prizes. She's like a well-known author. Now, the slide itself just talks about how the title relates to the actual work. So what the title has to do with the story inside the book. The connection between a title and the work isn't always clear. Sometimes you have to actually read the story to get a reference to something that's in the text. It says here, authors may choose to title a work in a certain way to suggest something about the theme or subject. But this isn't a hard rule. Titles also sometimes come from a direct quote in the text. So before you read something, you should think about what the title suggests. And as you read, keep in mind how that relates to the title. Now, the Jhumpa Larhi story in this section is written in second person point of view. So there's a knowledge article that's come up a few times if you've taken English with Edmonton before, or even just within this class, English 11B, there's been, this article's popped up once or twice before. So basically when you open it up, it gives you information about second person point of view and the different types of point of view. So it starts off with a list of information that you should have about different points of view, what perspective is, what point of view is. And then it gives you the definition of second person and third person. There are two different types of third person. So it gives you information about all of this. And then it goes on to explain why it's important to use second person in stories and what it actually does. They give you examples and everything. So take a moment to actually read through this. This is not an excerpt from an older book or anything like that. This is written in plain English. So you should take your time to try to go through these and understand them. I would also put these in your notes just in case you have any questions about what's here. If you look through this document and you don't understand it, I would take some time to book tutoring with either myself or Ms. Kathy Vahovic, and we can go over the information in this document to help you with preparing to read the excerpt. But if you've gone through any of our previous lessons on point of view, or you just need a refresher, this document is pretty good for that. And now here at the bottom, we have the link to the excerpt from Once in a Lifetime by Jhumpa Lahiri. And they want you to take special note of the cultural heritage influences that this story has. So make a note for anything that seems a little out of place or that you don't recognize, or that is clearly just a cultural reference to her Bengali Indian parents or lifestyle. Okay. I usually go through these analyses a little bit, just in case some of you have a difficult time with understanding the reading. So we're going to go through this. Sometimes you need to go through the analysis and actually see what's special about what you're writing before you reading before you go back and actually cover it. If that happens to be the case, then feel free to go through this with me. If you don't think that you need this, take time to pause and actually read through the document first. I would actually tell everyone to take a moment to try to read the document first, because since it's contemporary, it's written pretty in normal standardized English. There's no real issues with understanding the English that's used in here. So I don't think that any of you would have any problems with this. But with that being said, the analysis here. It says here at the top that the narrator in Once in a Lifetime is a young girl named Hema, who is a Bengali American who dutifully obeys her parents. As she speaks to you throughout the story, she's addressing Kaushik, a boy a few years older than she. And then they explain that by addressing Kaushik in the second person, Hema subconsciously compares their experiences as Bengali Americans. So the way the story is written is so that you get an intimate sense of who Hema is, because she's addressing you in the story. So the story is written as if you are Kaushik, and you get to know what her thoughts are and how she addresses you. So it says, although they are both the children of first-generation immigrants, they have vastly different experiences. Kaushik has lived both in the US and in India, while Hima has lived all of her life in the US. So it says, additionally, the role of the use of the word you helps the reader experience the Indian culture by assuming the role of you or Kaushik. So I give you an example at the bottom, because the second person point of view helps you understand Hima's inner feelings towards Kaushik. The story's told from her perspective, and basically you get to see all of her feelings being directed towards you. It gives the story an interesting twist and keeps your attention while you're learning more about Hima and how she feels about Kaushik. So on slide 23, they give you a little more information. It says that Hima's views of Kaushik are clouded by what she calls her schoolgirl crush on him. So she recognizes that she has a crush on him. And you can tell that she does because of the way that she addresses him. She uses very admiring words. She calls him beautiful and things like that. So you get a lot more intimacy for her feelings. You feel closer to the character because she's talking to you. It's almost like you are in the story is how they're addressing it. So she directly addresses Kaushik in the story and enters into a personal conversation. So you get to listen to her as if she's having the conversation with you. So that makes it feel a lot more closer than language that's just like, oh, well, she said this, or he and she are going to this place. You get to be the object that she is looking at and talking to and interacting with. And then they give you a listed drawback. So the drawback of the story being told from Hima's perspective is that the reader cannot see the relationship from Kaushik's point of view. You have no clue how Kaushik feels about anything. So that's the one drawback to second person point of view. But if your goal is to just give someone a glimpse into just that one person and give it a intimate sort of feel, second person point of view works really well. So then this slide goes on to say in the second paragraph that Larihi's beliefs and perspectives are evident throughout the story, especially her belief in aspects of Bengali culture. So you get to see through the story and through Hima and how she interacts with her parents, the importance of cultural traditions. And it says, additionally, the story maintains an interesting focus on names throughout, which might be reflective of Larihi's own life, because we know that names and how people use names in the US was something that she had to adjust to. In the story, Hima very rarely addresses Kaushik by name, referring to him mostly as you throughout the story. So not only does that make things feel like more personal to the reader, but it's also noticeable that she doesn't use Kaushik's name. Now there's some strategic, there's like some strategic moves that are happening with that. If she calls Kaushik as you most of the time, then it doesn't break the illusion to the reader that you are not Kaushik. But also it says a lot about Hima as a person that she doesn't use Kaushik's name within like the story itself. So that's important to notice. There's a special section where actually Hima says the logical thing would have been to say your name, but I felt inhibited and did not. So it's recognized even in the story. And then it says also, there's a strong sense of loyalty and hospitality through the text, especially in the way Hima's parents reach out to Kaushik's family. So these interactions exemplify the importance of those traits in the author's life. So actually reaching out, the loyalty and hospitality gives you a glimpse to how people within that culture interact with other people from that culture. All right, that's almost it for this lesson. So this last section is just on the focus on language section. So you get a bunch of vocabulary here. Like I say, for every live lesson review, you should definitely write down these words and write down the definition. If you don't need the pronunciation, then you don't have to write that down. If you don't need the other parts of speech, then don't. But if you do need them, Basically, make sure that you write down as much as you need. Whenever you see a table like this, that means that there's either going to be questions in the rest of the lesson about these vocabulary words, or there are going to be questions on the mastery test about them. So make sure that you actually write these down and put them in your notes, so that if you get a question that comes up where you have to select on the drop down which words fit where, you'll be able to look at these definitions and know. Alrighty, yep, that's it for this lesson, so I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay, so just as a recap, this lesson was just about contemporary literature, how culture affects literature, and what the important things are, so far as taking into account diverse cultures and things when it comes to storytelling, and how that became more and more popular within American culture during the contemporary movement. So just keep those things in mind. If you need to get help with reading the excerpt, although I don't think you will have any problems with it, feel free to still reach out for tutoring. Sometimes we all need help. You can seek out me or Kathy Vahovic. Ask your advocate or your teacher or mentor to put you in contact with us if you need help. There are only 3 more lessons in this unit, so we're getting towards the end now. Make sure that you are taking notes, that you're gathering your notes, organizing notes. You can use your old tests, the old mastery tests as part of your notes. You can use the post test as part of your notes. Make sure that you have things together to prepare for the final exam. Alrighty, this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with the rest of your English class.